So my project was deforestation of the Amazon rainforest for soy production. Because of its location on the globe, the Amazon rainforest supports really high optimal plant and animal biodiversity. It has high average temperatures and it pulls water from the coastal boundaries of Latin America to the continental interior. It's a biodiversity hotspot and it encompasses about 1.4 billion acres. Half of that land is in Brazil, but it also has land in Peru, Venezuela, Colombia, Bolivia, and Ecuador. Um, about 90 to 140 billion metric tons of carbon are sequestered in this area, and because of the Amazon River, these ecosystems are continually flooded and replenished with sediments and nutrients, which gives it a pretty high fertile soil composition. Um, right now, there are still about 350 indigenous ethnic groups found within the forest, and they still depend on traditional sustainable agroforestry for their food and clothing and medicine. Some of the oldest groups practiced intense slash and burn agriculture, and they did controlled burns of the land coupled with intercropping and polyculture systems. And even though the groups were relatively isolated from each other, the slash and burn system was the common thread between all the different cultures. And so they were able to cultivate sweet potato, manioc, sugarcane, and corn pretty much annually, and those were the staple crops that were able to sustain the populations while taking a pretty minimal toll on the environment. And they really didn't raise animals or livestock at all. So after colonization, urbanization and development began to encroach upon the rainforest. And as these South American countries started participating in world trade, their global economy kind of shifted the traditional agricultural systems. So initially, the Amazon was exploited for its wealth of timber, and once massive deforestation kind of occurred, there was large amounts of land available for raising livestock and growing crops, and it was found that soy's physiology was well adept to the climate and the environment, which led the Amazon to its fate of becoming one of the main production centers for growing soy monocultures for the global market. So during the late 20th century, investment towards the research of biofuels had began expanding as the oil market started to fluctuate and governments started to fund projects that explored capabilities of using soybean oil as a potential fuel. So this obviously led to rapid intensification of soy agriculture. So what happens is the raw product is then harvested and exported where it's turned into soybean oil for biofuel production. And corporations began specifically subsidizing these soy farms in the Amazon to further reduce the costs of their product. So the biofuel market did boost the economies of these developing Latin American countries, but it obviously took a very negative environmental toll. But only 20% of the soy harvested from the Amazon goes to biofuel production, and the remaining bit is used mostly to feed livestock. So countries are becoming more developed and increasingly raising their demand for meat and dairy products. So soy is a really good animal feed because it's high in protein and it allows the animal to grow to market weight faster. So countries like China and a bunch of European countries have been increasing their demand for pork and chicken as their middle classes have been growing, which facilitates trade agreements that also serve as economic boosters for soy production in these Amazonian systems. Any additional soy is then used in a lot of common food products like vegetarian meat substitutes, nutrition supplements, soups, gravies, and just other common food products. So the environmental impacts of soy farming are extensive. Large amounts of land are deforested, and a lot of the sequestered carbon is released when these areas are deforested. It increases soil erosion and facilitates habitat loss, and the contaminated, eroded soil is then washed into the Amazon River, which threatens local groups of indigenous people that depend on the Amazon River and kind of the fish and freshwater species in that ecosystem that live in the river. So one of the main ways that we can change the soy production system would to be lowering the demand for soy. However, until that happens, we can create a system that's sort of modified that has a less devastating impact on the biodiversity and soil quality of the area. So, looking at this newly deforested area in Brazil, one study found that increased deforestation was proportionately linked to soy and cattle farming. Cattle farming is kind of a new thing in this area, and almost every year the amount of cattle head actually doubles in these countries. And it's because the cleared land is an ideal area for cattle to graze and grow. But we can use this to our advantage and utilize the manure from the cattle to kind of add it to the soil and be an organic source of nutrients. So the first step to increase the sustainability of soy production would be to intercrop it in sort of a polyculture system with cassava, flint corn, and other native varieties of beans. Because all of these crops kind of work well with each other in establishing like really good symbiotic relationships with bacteria in the soil and their own mycorrhiza. All of these plants are annual crops, and in the warm tropical environment, they can reach maturity in about 2 to 3 months. So, what you do to harvest most of these are pulling the pods off the stalks, leaving behind a bunch of unused plant biomass. So, a way to deal with that is to do controlled burns of the excess plant biomass, and not only does this drive away pests that could be present, but it sort of acts as a biochar remediation as the ashes kind of fall into the soil. And even though some carbon dioxide is released, a good chunk of the carbon will just be sequestered back into the soil as well. But slash and burn agriculture is known for increasing erosion. So a way to remediate this would be to institute myco-restoration. And this is using fungi to repair or restore weakened immune systems of the environment. So basically, what you do is you till the soil and introduce mushroom spores that create extensive mycelial mats that run under the soil across the farms. And what the mycelial mats do is they hold together the different particle sizes of the soil, and it keeps the soil from compacting and purifies any water. And some of these mushrooms are actually mycopesticides, where native pests, when they come in contact with this underground, actually just die right on the spot. And it's found that these mycopesticide chemicals have a negative effect on pests, but not the native plants and animals in that area, which is kind of cool. So, addition of manure with companion planted polycultures and myco-restoration are the first kind of steps in transitioning this, but we can take it a step further by creating productive agroforestry systems. So what we would do is you would plant rows of crops in between rows of native trees and vegetation, and these trees could produce edible fruits for food, cooking oil, traditional medicines, and you could put pineapple trees, passion fruit trees, or just other nut-producing trees in between the rows of crops. And integrating the native flora back into the environment also provides increased habitat for species that would have been driven away during deforestation, like hummingbirds and aracarias and small monkeys that live in the area. You could also go another step further by adding cattle into the row-based system. So it would be kind of a succession of a row of cattle, a row of trees, a row of crops, a row of trees. And it kind of allows you to raise cattle, raise your soy crop, and have a bunch of other production systems simultaneously happening without producing a really big negative environmental effect. Also, different areas of the Amazon also experience weather variability, but generally, like this map shows, rainfall is pretty plentiful enough that supplemental irrigation is not needed, and corn and soy are also not really dependent on large amounts of water. So there's obviously a lot of socio-political economic factors that come into play. A recent study found that this industrial soy production system raised median rural income and reduced the overall percentage of poverty, but this means that income inequality rises since farms are getting bigger, but the numbers of actual individual farmers are not increasing, and this results in escalating tensions between rural and soy farmers and what indigenous groups are actually left in the area. Last year, there were 153 recorded land disputes, which often led to violent conflicts. Um, and this just further widens the cultural gaps between the people in this area. And it also jeopardizes the local and national food supplies since there's a decreased amount of land available to produce other varieties of food. And it usually brings in farmers from other regions that usually have their own foreign contractors. The soy market also dominates kind of like the politics surrounding these areas. The National Biodiesel Production Program uh, have a lot of stake in it since 78% of biofuels are made from soy. So, one thing that the governments have been doing were instituting social fuel stamps, which is where biodiesel companies must produce a minimum quantity of their feedstock from family farmers. And so, with a guaranteed contract from foreign consumers, small farmers can gain the necessary capital needed to start transitioning their farms into the previously proposed sustainable agroforestry soy system. And more recently, the National Institute of Colonization and Agrarian Reform have resettled landless farmers from poorer areas using cattle ranches that have gone bankrupt. Also, the pushback from remaining indigenous tribes and rural farmers have also pressured the government to address deforestation. And in 1965, Brazil and other soy producing countries made a legal requirement that 80% of each parcel within the Amazon biome must remain forested. Um, so it's obvious that the world soy market has a lot of economic and therefore political influence on policy and practices regarding farming in the Amazon. But with the proposed system, restoring the natural environment, producing food and fuel, and empowering local farmers, I think we can have national corporations fund the creation of these new integrated soy farms, and that would be the first step in reducing the detrimental effects that soy demand has on the environment and marginalized South American farmers.